If you have green eyes, you have probably noticed that they will not hold still. They look gray in a hospital corridor, and gold at a kitchen table, and something close to olive on an overcast afternoon by the sea. People have told you they change with your mood, which is not true, and with what you are wearing, which very nearly is. Somewhere along the way, somebody told you it came from an Irish grandmother, or a Scottish one, or that it skipped a generation, or that it was recessive and therefore simple. Almost everything in that sentence is wrong. Green eyes are the rarest of the common eye colors. Somewhere around 2% of the world has them, which is roughly 1 person in 50. And that figure has been repeated so often that it has stopped meaning anything. Here is what it should mean. Of the 8 billion people alive right now, more than 7.5 billion have brown eyes, or blue eyes, or something in between, and a very small number have this one, and it is not distributed randomly across the planet. It clusters. It clusters hard, in a narrow band of the world, in a pattern that took 20 years of genetics and a great many ancient skeletons to explain. And when researchers finally did explain it, the answer was not the one anybody expected. Green eyes do not descend from a single ancient people. They are not the surviving mark of one population. They are the opposite of that. They are what happens at a seam, where separate ancestries meet and neither one wins. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly where that color comes from, and you will also understand why there is no such thing as a green eye. Before we go further, if you are the kind of person who finds the buried side of human ancestry fascinating, take a moment to subscribe. This is the kind of research that mainstream coverage flattens into a single sentence, and we go through it properly here. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and let us continue. The scientific story of eye color begins in 1907, and it begins with a mistake that lasted a century. That year, an American biologist named Charles Davenport, working with his wife Gertrude Davenport, published a study of eye color inheritance in families. Their conclusion was elegant. Brown was dominant, blue was recessive, and the whole thing followed the simple rules that Gregor Mendel had worked out with pea plants 40 years earlier. 2 blue-eyed parents could only produce blue-eyed children. 1 gene, 2 versions, clean arithmetic. It was tidy, it was teachable, and it went into school books around the world, where it remains to this day. It was also wrong, and the consequences of it being wrong were not confined to biology lessons. Davenport went on to found and run the eugenics record office at Cold Spring Harbor, and the idea that complex human traits obeyed simple Mendelian rules was central to everything that institution argued for. If a trait was 1 gene, then a person could be sorted, predicted, and classified. Eye color was one of the showpiece examples used to make that case. The showpiece was built on an oversimplification that the underlying data never actually supported, and the people who noticed said so at the time and were not listened to. 2 blue-eyed parents can have a brown-eyed child. It is uncommon, it is documented in the medical literature, and it has ruined more than one family's afternoon over the years for no reason at all. Completely wrong. To understand what actually produces the color, you have to start with a fact that surprises nearly everyone who hears it. There is no green pigment in a green eye. There is no blue pigment in a blue eye either. The human iris contains exactly 2 pigments, and both of them are melanin. One is eumelanin, which is brown to black. The other is pheomelanin, which is a yellowish red. That is the entire palette. There is nothing in there that is blue, and nothing that is green, and nothing that could be. So where does the color come from? It comes from physics. The front layer of the iris, called the stroma, is a mesh of collagen fibers and cells. When light enters it, the shorter wavelengths at the blue end of the spectrum scatter more than the longer ones, and some of that scattered blue light comes back out toward the observer. It is the same effect that makes the sky blue, and makes a jay's feather blue. And it has a name, the Tyndall effect, closely related to Rayleigh scattering. If the layer behind the stroma contains a great deal of melanin, that melanin absorbs the scattered light before it can escape, and the eye reads as brown. If there is very little melanin, the scattered blue light comes back cleanly, and the eye reads as blue. Green sits between those two states, and it needs both of them at once. A green iris has a small amount of melanin, enough to add a yellowish cast but not enough to absorb the scattering. And the blue coming back from the structure mixes with that faint yellow to produce the color you see. Blue plus yellow, structure plus pigment. Neither one alone would do it. Which is why green eyes will not hold still. A brown eye is brown because of a pigment, and pigments look much the same in any light. A green eye is a two-part optical effect, and the balance between the parts shifts, depending on the angle of the light and the wavelengths available in it. Which is why yours are gray indoors, and gold near a window, and something else entirely outside on a bright day. Nothing about your eyes is changing. What is changing is the light you are handing them to work with. Now the numbers. Roughly 79% of the world has brown eyes, which makes brown so overwhelmingly the human condition that everything else is a regional exception. Somewhere between 8 and 10% have blue. Around 5% have hazel, and around 5% have amber or gray, depending on how the categories are drawn. Green comes in last, at around 2% globally. Before we go further, those percentages deserve a warning label, because they are softer than they sound. There is no agreed scientific definition of green. Eye color is a continuous range, and every study that reports figures has to cut that range into bins somewhere, and different research groups cut it in different places. Some use a 3-category scale of blue, intermediate, and brown, which erases green entirely by folding it into the middle. Others use scales of 8 or 12 or 16 reference photographs. Some studies rely on trained observers under controlled lighting. A great many rely on people describing their own eyes on a form, which introduces every bias you would expect, since people with genuinely hazel eyes very often write green, and people with gray-green eyes very often write blue. Then there is the lighting problem, which is not trivial for this particular color. The same iris photographed under a window and under a fluorescent tube can land in 2 different bins on the same scale. There is a reason ophthalmologists have spent decades trying to standardize iris photography and have never entirely succeeded. The 2% figure is repeated everywhere, and it is probably the right order of magnitude, and it should be treated as an estimate rather than a measurement. The same applies to almost every national figure you will see quoted for green eyes, including some of the most confidently stated ones. The overall pattern is solid and well replicated. The decimal places are not. But globally is the wrong frame, because green is barely present across most of the globe. In East Asia, it is close to non-existent. Across Africa and South Asia and the indigenous populations of the Americas, effectively absent. Almost every green-eyed person on Earth traces ancestry to one part of one continent, and within that part the frequency climbs steeply as you travel northwest. In Central and Eastern Europe, green becomes noticeable. In Hungary, it has been reported at figures far above the world average, though the sampling behind some of the most quoted numbers deserves more scrutiny than it usually gets. Further west and north, the light eye frequency as a whole becomes extraordinary. In Iceland, in Scotland, in Ireland, studies have found that the large majority of the population has blue or green eyes rather than brown, with figures in some samples approaching 9 and 10. Ireland and Scotland are routinely cited as the highest concentrations of green eyes anywhere on the planet. So the obvious conclusion is the one everybody reaches. Green eyes come from the Celtic Northwest, an ancient people, an isolated corner of Europe, a trait preserved where the world could not reach it. That is not what the DNA says. Here is what it says instead. In the year 2010, and increasingly through the decade that followed, ancient DNA revealed that modern Europeans are not descended from one ancestral population. They are a mixture of 3, and the mixing happened relatively recently. The first were the hunter-gatherers, present in Europe for tens of thousands of years, through the Ice Age and out the other side. The second were farmers, who spread out of Anatolia, beginning around 9,000 years ago, moving west one generation of fields at a time, bringing agriculture and a genetically distinct population with them. The third arrived from the steppe north of the Black Sea and the Caspian, beginning around 5,000 years ago, and they reshaped the continent again, bringing with them the ancestry that now dominates northern Europe and, most linguists think, the Indo-European languages. Those three populations looked different from one another, and crucially, they carried different pigmentation genetics. The European hunter-gatherers carried the alleles for light eyes, and, in the individuals sequenced so far, alleles associated with darker skin. The Anatolian farmers carried the reverse combination, lighter skin and predominantly dark eyes. The steppe populations carried their own mixture again. And here is the finding that reframes the whole question. Green eyes are not the signature of any one of those three groups. Green eyes appear where they overlap. Where hunter-gatherer light eye variants land in the same person as pigmentation variants from the farming and steppe populations, the result is an iris with just enough melanin to tint the scattering and not enough to hide it. Green is what an intermediate looks like. It is an ancestry ratio made visible. That is why the map looks the way it does. The northwest of Europe has the highest proportions of hunter-gatherer-derived light eye variants, which is why light eyes of any kind are so common there. Central and Eastern Europe sit in a different balance, which is why green specifically peaks in some of those populations. And everywhere in the world where those three ancestries never met at all, green eyes are essentially absent, because the ingredients never came into contact. Green eyes are not a relic of an isolated ancient people. They are evidence of mixture. That is the true origin, and it is very nearly the opposite of the story that gets told about them. Now, the gene. The main switch for human eye color sits on chromosome 15, and the way it works is genuinely odd. The pigment gene itself is called OCA2, and it does the work of putting melanin into the iris. But the variant that predicts eye color better than anything else is not in OCA2 at all. It is in a neighboring gene called HERC2, in a stretch that does not code for any protein, and its job is regulatory. It is a switch that controls how much OCA2 gets used. One version of that switch leaves OCA2 running normally, producing melanin and brown eyes. The other version turns the volume down, and the iris ends up with far less pigment than it otherwise would. In 2008, a team at the University of Copenhagen, led by Hans Eiberg, published the finding that made headlines everywhere. Every blue-eyed person they examined, across a range of populations, carried the same version of that switch, sitting inside the same surrounding stretch of DNA. Not similar versions, the same one. That kind of pattern means the variant arose once, in one individual, and everything since has descended from them. The team estimated the mutation at somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years old, and suggested a point of origin somewhere in the region of the Black Sea. That estimate has been substantially revised, and this is where ancient DNA rewrote the textbook. Sequencing of Mesolithic European remains has now found the light eye variant present in hunter-gatherers thousands of years earlier than the original estimate allowed, in individuals scattered from Spain to Scandinavia. The single founder part of the finding has held up well. The date has moved backwards, and the geography has become less certain rather than more. It is a good example of how a famous result gets partially confirmed and partially dismantled by better evidence, which is what is supposed to happen. And the switch on chromosome 15 only takes you so far, because it does a very good job of predicting blue versus brown, and a much poorer job of predicting anything in the middle. Green is in the middle. In 2021, a large international study published in Science Advances analyzed the genomes of nearly 200,000 people and identified around 60 loci associated with eye color, most of them previously unknown. That is not one gene, it is not two. It is dozens of separate positions in the genome, each contributing a small nudge, and the color you end up with is the sum of all of them interacting with the structure of your particular iris, which finally explains something that has confused families for generations. Green eyes appear unpredictably. They turn up in a family with no history of them and skip children who should have inherited them, and no Punnett square drawn on a napkin will ever account for it, because the trait was never running on the rules that napkin assumes. When dozens of loci each contribute a fraction, the outcomes at the extremes are fairly reliable, and the outcomes in the middle are close to a lottery. Brown parents reliably make brown children most of the time. Green is where the arithmetic gives up. There is something else in this story that almost nobody talks about, and when it was published, it produced headlines that most people misunderstood. In 2014, researchers sequenced the genome of a man who died around 7,000 years ago in what is now northern Spain, found in a cave at La Braña in León. He was a hunter-gatherer, from the population that had been in Europe since long before farming arrived. His genome carried the light eye variant on chromosome 15. It also carried ancestral versions of the genes most associated with pale skin in modern Europeans, meaning he almost certainly had dark skin. 4 years later, the same combination turned up in Britain when Cheddar Man, a 10,000-year-old skeleton from a Somerset gorge, was sequenced and reconstructed. Dark skin, light eyes. Similar results have come from Mesolithic remains in Sweden and Luxembourg. The public conversation fixated entirely on skin color and mostly argued about it. The genuinely interesting part went almost unremarked. Light eyes in Europe are older than pale skin in Europe. The trait that everyone associates with a Northern European appearance arrived first, in populations that did not look Northern European in any other respect, and it spent thousands of years in bodies nobody today would picture when they imagine its origin. Whatever caused light eyes to spread, it was not spreading alongside the rest of the package. It moved on its own, earlier, for its own reasons. Which raises the question that the field still has not answered. Why did it spread at all? Light eyes offer no obvious survival advantage. They do not improve vision. In several respects, they do the opposite, since a lightly pigmented iris lets more stray light into the eye, which is why so many light-eyed people squint in bright conditions and reach for sunglasses earlier than everyone around them. There is no plausible story in which having less pigment in the iris helped anyone find food or avoid a predator. Researchers have proposed several explanations, and none of them is settled. The first is that eye color rode along with something else. Pigmentation genes are interconnected, and selection acting on skin pigmentation for vitamin D synthesis at high latitudes could have carried linked eye color variants along, without eye color itself ever being the target. That is the most conservative explanation, and possibly the correct one, though the ancient DNA showing light eyes, arriving well before pale skin, complicates it considerably. The second is sexual selection. The argument, associated most prominently with the Canadian anthropologist Peter Frost, is that rare and striking traits attract disproportionate attention in mate choice, and that in small populations under particular demographic pressures, this could drive an otherwise neutral variant upward. It is a coherent argument. It is also extremely difficult to test, and a great many researchers regard it as unproven speculation dressed in evolutionary language. Treat it as a hypothesis, not a finding. The third is simply drift. Small populations, isolated valleys, founder effects, and a variant that costs nothing, and therefore is never removed. In the absence of any pressure at all, chance is sufficient. Given the number of generations available and the small size of Mesolithic European groups, drift can do a great deal of work on its own. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and that the people saying they know are usually selling something. There is a comparison worth making here, and it puts the whole subject in a different light. Go through the primates, all of them, every species of monkey and ape on Earth, and you will not find another one that does this. Chimpanzees have dark eyes. Gorillas have dark eyes. Orangutans, bonobos, baboons, macaques, lemurs, every one of them, dark. There is essentially no variation within those species, and none of the variation you do find approaches what humans manage. Our closest living relatives, whose genomes differ from ours by a couple of %, are uniform in a trait where we are spectacularly not. And there is a second thing about human eyes that no other primate shares. The white of your eye is visible. In almost every other primate, the sclera is pigmented, and roughly the same shade as the iris, which means that from a short distance away, it is very difficult to tell where another individual is looking. In humans, the contrast between the white sclera, the colored iris, and the black pupil is so stark that anyone across a room can follow your gaze precisely. There is a well-known argument about why, usually called the cooperative eye hypothesis, associated with the work of Michael Tomasello and colleagues. It proposes that visible gaze direction is only an advantage in a species where being watched is more useful than being unreadable, which is to say a species that cooperates far more than it competes at close quarters. Human infants follow eye direction alone. Chimpanzee infants follow head direction and largely ignore the eyes. The hypothesis has its critics, and the evidence is not conclusive, but the anatomical fact underneath it is not in dispute. Put those two facts together, and the eye color question changes shape. We are a species that evolved unusually legible eyes, and then, in one branch of one continent within the last 15,000 years, produced enormous variation in the color sitting inside them. Whether those two things are connected is exactly the sort of question that is easy to speculate about and extremely hard to test, and it is one of the reasons the sexual selection argument keeps resurfacing despite the weakness of the evidence for it. Something made human eyes conspicuous. Something else made them varied. Nobody has shown that the two are the same something. There is a cost, though, and it is worth stating carefully because it gets exaggerated in both directions online. Melanin in the eye does the same job it does anywhere else in the body, which is absorbing light and the energy it carries. Less of it means less protection. Light-colored irises are associated with a measurably higher risk of uveal melanoma, a cancer of the eye that is rare in absolute terms, but consistently more common in light-eyed populations. There is also a well-documented association with photophobia, meaning genuine discomfort in bright light, rather than mere preference, and some evidence linking lighter iris pigmentation with certain forms of age-related macular degeneration. None of that is cause for alarm. Uveal melanoma remains uncommon, the individual risk is small, and the practical implications are the same ones an ophthalmologist would give anyone. Wear sunglasses that actually block ultraviolet light. Get your eyes examined periodically. That is the whole intervention. But it is a real trade-off, in the same way that lighter skin trades ultraviolet protection for vitamin D synthesis, and it is part of why the trait cannot simply be described as neutral. Genetics is full of these exchanges. Nothing comes without a cost. There is also a decent chance that what you have been calling green is not one color at all, and that you have never looked closely enough to notice. Central heterochromia describes an iris, where the ring immediately around the pupil is a different color from the outer portion, usually a warmer gold or amber inside, and a cooler shade outside. It is extremely common in people who describe their eyes as green or hazel, and from any normal conversational distance, the two zones blend into a single perceived color that is neither one. Stand in front of a mirror in strong daylight and look properly. A great many people watching this are about to discover they have two colors in each eye and have had them their whole lives. Then there is sectoral heterochromia, where a wedge of the iris is a different color from the rest, like a slice cut out of a wheel, and complete heterochromia, where the two eyes are different colors entirely. Complete heterochromia is genuinely uncommon in humans, though it is so ordinary in some dog breeds that nobody remarks on it. In humans, it can be entirely benign and inherited, and it can also be acquired later in life through injury, inflammation, or certain medications, which is why an eye that changes color in adulthood is one of the few things in this entire subject that genuinely warrants a trip to a doctor rather than an inner. None of this is a defect. It is a reminder that the iris is not painted a color. It is a structure, built cell by cell during development, and structures built that way are never perfectly uniform. The color you report on a form is your brain averaging a patterned surface into a single word. There is also one condition that sits at the far edge of this story, and it has a beginning, a discovery, and a name. In 1951, a Dutch ophthalmologist and geneticist named Petrus Johannes Vardenberg described a pattern he had noticed recurring in families. The affected individuals had unusually brilliant pale blue eyes, sometimes two different colored eyes in the same face, often a distinctive white streak in the hair at the front of the head, and frequently they were deaf from birth. Wardenberg recognized that these apparently unrelated features were arriving together too consistently to be coincidence, and he proposed that a single underlying cause connected them. He was right, and the reason is one of the more elegant explanations in human biology. Early in embryonic development, a population of cells called the neural crest forms along the developing spine and then migrates outward through the body, becoming a remarkable variety of different things depending on where it ends up. Some become the pigment cells of the skin, the hair, and the iris. Others become part of the inner ear. If something disrupts that migration, everything downstream of it is affected at once. Pigment cells never reach the iris in normal numbers, which is why the eyes are so pale. They never reach a patch of hair, which is why the white forelock appears. And they never reach the structures of the inner ear that require them, which is why hearing is affected. Waardenburg syndrome is rare, affecting roughly 1 person in 40,000. But it demonstrates something that applies to everyone watching. Eye color is not a decorative feature bolted onto the front of the face. It is a readout of a developmental process that touches the skin, the hair, the ear, and the nervous system, and the genes involved are doing several jobs at once. The color is the visible end of something much larger. Look at the world map of eye color, and it stops being a chart of appearance and becomes a chart of movement. It shows you where 3 ancient populations met, and in what proportions. It shows you the gradient running from southeast to northwest across Europe, which is the same gradient you get if you map hunter-gatherer ancestry, or Anatolian farmer ancestry, or steppe ancestry, because they are all measuring the same event from different angles. It shows you, in a trait visible from across a room, the shape of a migration that finished 4,000 years before anyone could write it down. Ancient DNA keeps sharpening this. 15 years ago, there were almost no sequenced ancient European genomes. Now there are thousands. And pigmentation variants are among the easiest things to read out of them, because they are single, well-characterized positions rather than complex ancestry calculations. They have found the light eye variant in Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from Spain, Luxembourg, and Sweden, thousands of years before farming reached any of those places. They have found that the incoming Anatolian farmers overwhelmingly carried the dark eye version, which means the first agricultural communities in Europe looked different from the people already living there, in a way that would have been immediately obvious to both sides. They have found that pale skin variants spread through Europe later, and faster than light eye variants did, on a different schedule, and probably for different reasons. And they have found intermediate populations, at the boundaries and after the mixing, carrying combinations that had never existed on Earth before those groups came into contact. These are not anonymous statistics. They have names, or at least labels, and the labels have become familiar to anyone following the field. Loschbohr, a man who died in Luxembourg around 8,000 years ago. The Motala individuals from southern Sweden, from roughly the same era. Labranja one, from the Spanish cave. Cheddarman, in Somerset. All hunter-gatherers, all separated by hundreds or thousands of miles, and all carrying the light eye variant. On the other side of the comparison sit the early farmers of Anatolia and the Balkans, and the Yamnaya of the Pontic steppe whose descendants poured into Europe from around 5,000 years ago, and whose ancestry now makes up a substantial fraction of every northern European genome. Line those groups up and the picture is unambiguous. The trait was in Europe before farming, before metal, before the wheel, before anyone on the continent spoke a language that has any modern descendant. It was carried by people who lived in small mobile groups, hunted large animals, and had no idea that the ice had only recently gone, or that anyone was living anywhere else. Somewhere in that period, In the millennia when those populations were merging across the whole of Europe, the first green eyes appeared. Not in one place, not once. Wherever the ratio happened to land in the middle, which was in a great many places at a great many times, because the mixing was continent-wide, and it went on for thousands of years. That is the second migration story here, and it is worth stating plainly, because most people carry a version of European prehistory in their heads that is 100 years out of date. There was no single ancestral European people. There was a hunter-gatherer population, dark-skinned and light-eyed, that had been in place since the Ice Age. There were farmers who walked west out of Anatolia over 3,000 years, absorbing and replacing as they went. There were herders who came off the steppe with wheels and horses and reorganized the continent again. Everyone alive in Europe today is a blend of all three, in proportions that shift as you move across the map, and every visible trait that people treat as ancestral is really a readout of that blend. There are questions the science has not closed, and the honest ones are the interesting ones. Why is green so much harder to predict from DNA than blue or brown? Forensic systems can call blue and brown from a genetic sample with accuracy above 90%, and their performance on intermediate colors falls dramatically, in some evaluations to little better than a coin flip. Part of the answer is polygenicity. Part is that green depends on iris structure, as well as pigment, and structure is not something anyone can currently read from a genome. And part may simply be that green is a category humans invented, rather than one biology recognizes. A bin we put a continuous range into, because our language has a word for it. Why do so many babies change eye color in their first year? Melanin production in the iris is not finished at birth, and continues for months afterwards, which is why a great many pale-eyed infants end up brown-eyed toddlers, and why the change so often happens somewhere between 6 and 12 months. What nobody can currently do is predict which ones will change and which will not. The genetics that determine the endpoint are understood in outline and close to useless in any individual case, which is why every prediction made over a cot by a confident relative is a guess wearing a lab coat. Green makes this worse rather than better. Because green requires an intermediate amount of pigment, a child heading toward green passes through blue on the way, and looks, for several months, exactly like a child heading toward blue and stopping there. There is no way to tell them apart at 4 months. There is barely a way to tell them apart at 9. And because the process can continue subtly into early childhood, a fair number of people have eyes that finished settling long after anyone was still paying attention to them. And why did light eyes spread so far, so fast, in a population where they conferred no obvious advantage? That is the central open question. It has been open for 2 decades, and it will probably be answered by somebody currently working through a very large pile of ancient genomes, watching the frequency change across actual centuries instead of guessing at it from the present. The lineages that pass down unbroken add their own confirmation to the picture. Maternal haplogroup U5 is the signature line of the European hunter-gatherers, present on the continent before farming and still carried at elevated frequencies in the north and northwest. The maternal lineages that arrived with Anatolian farming and the paternal lineages that arrived from the steppe both have their own distributions, and all 3 sets can be mapped independently. Lay those maps over the map of eye color, and they agree. Not perfectly, because nothing in population genetics agrees perfectly, but closely enough that the correspondence cannot be coincidence. The maternal lines, the paternal lines, and the pigmentation variants describe the same 3-way merger from 3 different directions. There is a quieter layer underneath all of it. Your eye color is the first thing anyone learns about you, in the sense that it is visible from further away than almost any other detail, and it is a thing you did not choose and could not have earned. It was settled before you were born, by the interaction of dozens of variants inherited from 2 people who were not consulted about it either. And the specific combination that produced it is unrepeatable. Not rare, unrepeatable. 60 loci recombining independently means the odds against any exact combination recurring are effectively unbounded, which means that in the entire history of the species, and in whatever is left of its future, nobody else has ever had or will ever have precisely the iris you are looking at in the mirror. Not a sibling, not a child. The category is shared by 150 million people. The particular thing is not. That is not sentimentality. It is just what happens when a trait depends on dozens of independently assorting variants and a structural mesh of collagen that forms slightly differently in every person who has ever developed one. Now, we should address the things that get attached to this subject, because green eyes attract a peculiar amount of nonsense. You will find claims online that green eyes indicate descent from a lost civilization, or from a specific ancient bloodline, or from somewhere off this planet entirely. There are entire communities built around the idea, and the arguments they use follow a predictable shape. The trait is rare. Rarity requires an explanation. The ordinary explanation is boring. Therefore, the explanation must be extraordinary. The historical version of this was not harmless. In medieval and early modern Europe, unusual appearance attracted suspicion in a general way, and eye color turns up in folklore, in accusations, and in the documentary record of witch trials as one of the marks that could be read against a person. The evil eye, in its various regional forms across Europe and the Mediterranean and beyond, is one of the most widely distributed superstitions in human history, and in several traditions, it attaches specifically to light or unusual eyes in populations where most eyes are dark. Green in particular carried associations with jealousy, deceit, and the uncanny in a great deal of European literature, and those associations were not confined to poetry. People were accused of things on the basis of how they looked at other people. So the impulse to read meaning into a color is very old, and it has generally gone badly for whoever was on the receiving end of it. The modern internet version is far gentler than the medieval one, since being told you are descended from a lost civilization is a considerable improvement on being told you are a witch. It is the same reflex either way. The finding itself dismantles all of it, and this is the part worth holding on to. Green eyes are not the mark of a separate lineage. They are the visible product of populations mixing. They exist because groups that had been apart for tens of thousands of years came back together and had children, over and over, for millennia. If you were looking for a physical trait that stood as evidence against the idea of a pure or separate ancestry, you would struggle to design a better one than this. It is mixture, expressed as a color. So what does it actually mean? Sitting there with eyes that will not decide what shade they are. It means the color you carry is older than any nation and any flag and every border on any map you have ever seen, and that it did not come down to you from one people in one place. It means at least 3 ancient populations, who would have regarded each other as complete strangers, are all represented in the specific balance of pigment in the front of your eye. It means your ancestors were the meeting point, rather than the isolated remnant. And here is what it does not mean. It does not make you Irish or Scottish or Hungarian. It does not make anyone more ancient, more European, more special, or more anything, and it is not a marker of a bloodline, an inheritance, or a lost people. Every living human is a composite of the same repeated mixing, the same arrivals and absorptions, the same forgotten grandparents from somewhere else that nobody wrote down. What eye color records is not a pedigree, it is an average, a number that landed in the middle because the ingredients that produced it came from more than one direction. The next time somebody asks what color your eyes are, and you have to think about it before answering. The next time a photograph makes them look like a completely different color from the one you gave on your driving license. The next time you catch them in a mirror in unfamiliar light, and briefly do not recognize your own face, remember what you are actually looking at. Blue light coming back out of a mesh of collagen, tinted by a trace of pigment, in a proportion set by the collision of 3 ancient populations who never knew the others existed. And remember that the ambiguity is not a flaw in your eyes, it is the whole mechanism. A brown eye is a straightforward answer to the question of what color it is, because a pigment absorbs what it absorbs regardless of circumstances. Your eyes do not give a straightforward answer because they are not producing a color at all. They are producing a relationship between the light available and the structure it hits, and relationships are conditional by nature. The people who tell you your eyes change with your mood are describing something real and attributing it to the wrong cause. What changed was the room. The science is still early. 20 years ago, the working model was one gene and a Punnett square. 10 years ago, it was one switch on chromosome 15. Now it is 60 loci and counting, and the number will keep climbing as sample sizes grow. And the structural component of the color has barely been touched, because nobody yet knows how to read the architecture of an iris out of a genome. Some of what has been stated confidently in this video will be revised within a decade. That is not a weakness in the field. That is the field working. If you have green eyes, you carry something specific. You carry a trait that arrived in Europe in dark-skinned hunter-gatherers more than 10,000 years ago and survived every population upheaval since. You carry the balance point between three ancestral peoples who spent thousands of years replacing and absorbing one another. You carry a color that does not exist as a pigment anywhere in your body, produced instead by the same physics that makes the sky look the way it does. And you carry it not because anyone preserved it, and not because it was ever an advantage, but because your ancestors happened to be standing where the mixing happened. Your ancestry is older than you were taught. Your origins are stranger and more crowded than the single grandmother anyone ever pointed at. And the honest version, the one written into 60 scattered positions on your chromosomes and a mesh of collagen a fraction of a millimeter thick, is the better story by a considerable distance. Thank you for spending this time with us. The history written into that color is real, the science behind it is real, and the story of where you actually come from is only starting to be read.